All right, welcome everybody to another edition of Grid Down Consulting. Today I've got an awesome guest. I can't believe I haven't had him on here sooner, but very lucky to have him with us today, especially with all that's going on in the world right now with Afghanistan falling here this past week. But today we have on the show with us Command Master Sergeant Michael Mabee. So you probably every single one of my videos that I've made so far, I've probably made reference to him in one form or another. He is the tip of the spear in going after the electric utilities and holding them to account and researching where they are deceiving us and where they are hiding information. So he's a very valuable person in our movement to secure the grid. So Michael Mabee has had 24 years. He's retired now, 24 years in the U.S. Army. He was a platoon sergeant in Operations Desert Shield, Desert Storm, and provide comfort. So he was part of, he's a veteran of both Persian Gulf Wars. He served as a brigade level command sergeant major in Iraq. For over a decade, Michael, now has conducted public interest research on the security of the electric grid, because of the absolutely vital role of this infrastructure in powering everyone in the nation's 16 critical infrastructures and in undergirding not just the well-being, but the very survival of our country. Michael Mabee maintains, if you go to his website, michaelmabee.org, that's M-A-B-E-E, michaelmabee.org. Michael maintains one of the world's most comprehensive grid security databases as an unpaid volunteer. So that's another thing. I've donated to Michael in the past, what I could. I urge everybody, he does this in his spare time, outside of his 9 to 5. He uses his wife's grocery money to go after FERC and NERC. So I urge everyone to go in there and donate to him and help him continue the fight and to continue revealing the information that the electric utilities don't want us to know about. He's been quoted by the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and many other publications on grid security, and has intervened and submitted testimony in over 200 federal dockets on electric grid security issues. He has participated in federal rulemaking related to the grid security. He continues to write and speak about emergency preparedness for a long-term blackout. So without further ado, Michael Mabee, thanks so much for being on the show today, and glad to have you with us.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's an honor to be here.
So, it would, I can't even start this conversation without discussing what's happening in the news as we speak. The images of Afghanistan falling to the Taliban and our enemy, and the fact that we just basically armed a terrorist regime for the next 20 years with, I don't know what it is, but we gave them $80 billion worth of equipment. I'm going to read off here real quick the list of things. So again, if you've been living under a rock and you don't really know exactly what we've given to the terrorists, I don't have it in front of me, but I'm going to paraphrase. We've given them 600,000, or we gave Afghanistan this, and the Taliban has full control of it now, but we gave them 600,000 small arms, 7,000 machine guns, 78,000 vehicles, of which 4,700 were Humvees. I forget how many thousands of armored MRAPs that they have, 20,000 plus grenades, 2,500 bombs. I think there's like 1,500 rocket launchers or missile launchers. The big ones, 35 Blackhawk helicopters, over 100 planes, body armor, surveillance equipment, 168,000 pieces of communications equipment. The big one to me was 16,000 sets of NVGs, of different types of night vision goggles. I mean, the U.S. Special Forces for many years has said, we own the night. And anytime we went into one of these holes in the ground, we would send our special forces in at night because we could see and they couldn't. And that's just no longer going to be the case. And, I was speaking with General Krosniak yesterday on this. We recorded it, so we'll be releasing that video soon, but fully anticipate a lot of this hardware to leak all throughout the Middle East to other terrorist organizations, Al Qaeda, into Pakistan. It's going to be going, this is really likely to set the Middle East on fire again. And really, we basically armed our enemy with U.S. military hardware. So, feel free to. So what are your thoughts, Michael, and what we're seeing? And
yeah, I was just looking, reading an article in the Wall Street Journal this morning, and they had some really compelling pictures of the equipment that the Taliban now is in possession of. One thing I thought was really interesting is, one of these Taliban fighters had a night vision scope somehow mounted onto his RPG, which isn't normal. It's a U.S. night vision device. So they're taking this equipment and they're using it. You see them all with American weapons now. Years ago, they were all AK-47s, and now we're seeing them with American-made weapons, American-made optics. But another thing that really hasn't been talked about too much, and I think it's also quite dangerous, is the fact that when the Taliban swept through Afghanistan and took over all of these police stations and all of these army bases and all of these provinces, any type of confidential or classified information that we shared with the Afghan government or the Afghan military has also fallen into the hands of the Taliban. So on the one hand, I'd like to believe that we were careful about what we shared with our partners in Afghanistan, who subsequently collapsed, and now all of this is in the Taliban's hand. But when you kind of look at our conduct of the war over the last 2 decades, honestly, it doesn't inspire confidence that we were smart. So there's no way that we know what type of intelligence information in addition to all this equipment. And the equipment that they can't use, they're just going to sell. Like I don't really see the Taliban anytime soon having a viable air force,
right?
But they most certainly can sell these planes to third parties. The equipment that they can't use, we've just basically, filled their coffers, with things that they can, use to make money for their regimes. So there really is no part of our entire 2 decades in Afghanistan, other than perhaps the first month, which I think was, pretty impressive how fast a couple of special forces teams, were able to get the Taliban overthrown. But, everything after that, the only word I can think of is debacle.
Yeah. So, I mean, discussing the Middle East is very difficult for me. Being prior military myself, I support the military, and it's hard to, you always look at Gaddafi, and you look at a lot of these players and a lot of these people that we've been overthrowing over the last couple decades. And the whole idea of nation building. So I believe that you can nation build in Europe and you can nation build in most countries, but these countries in the Middle East operate their governments based off of theocracy, Sharia law, and their government is their religion. It's all tied into one thing. So if you go in there and you topple their government, I mean, most of these Middle Eastern countries have no desire to live by Western values. I mean, there are some progressive Muslims in these countries that, want to be, a modern international player, but the majority of the people in these countries have no desire to live like we live, and women's rights and all this other stuff. And so I'm not debating whether they should or shouldn't. It's just the fact of the matter of, we go in there and we try and transform these countries, and it's just, I mean, if this is an evidence that they don't want what we have, they don't want democracy, they want they may not want the Taliban, but they want to live under their theocratic rules, right? And so it's just so I struggle. I knew that we the idea, a lot of people have been saying, oh, we couldn't stay there forever, but what about South Korea? What about, we have a presence in South Korea. We have a presence in, trying to think of some of the other countries where, is it Germany? I mean, there's multiple countries where we have a military base. We've been there for 50 years, right? And so maintaining a couple thousand people in Afghanistan might not have been the worst, and providing air support for them to maintain their country might not have been the worst plan,
Yeah.
So I don't have all the answers. You know, this stuff is above my pay grade, yours too, I imagine. But
yeah. Well, and the thing is, when you think about it, Jonathan, we're still studying the Battle of Little Bighorn, in
right.
70 or 1876. That was, and we're still studying that to this day. I mean, we're going to be studying Afghanistan for years, and there's going to be lots of people with different opinions. But I think one of the things that you mentioned, nation building. So militarily, presently, which isn't going to last long, but presently there really isn't anybody that has been able to oppose the United States militarily. So that's never been the problem. I mean, we rolled into Iraq, we rolled into Afghanistan, Panama, Grenada, the military piece of it isn't the problem. It's the political piece. And you're absolutely right.
For sure.
I kind of half jokingly say, instead of sending in the 4th Infantry Division, why didn't we send in Walmart and just wait 10 years? We have forgotten how to nation build. So after World War II, and you have to remember, with World War II, it was a total war, and everybody was involved. If you weren't in the military, you were working in a factory churning out planes and ammunition. We've got the Rosie the Riveter posters. The entire country was involved. There was rationing going on in the United States. If you needed tires for your car, you had to have a ration ticket for that. You had to have a ration ticket if you wanted to buy butter. The whole country was involved and committed to this total war. And when it was over, we nation built Germany and Japan. So, in terms of cultures, there couldn't have been a farther culture from the United States than Japan. Maybe Germany was a little closer, being a European country, and but Japan was a completely different culture. And yet, look at the results. Look at what we were able to do. We turned Germany and Japan after the war into their own viable nations, who have a place on the world stage, who are, great partners, with the world in many respects. We may not always agree with, everything from Germany.
Right, but you would agree that those countries weren't theocratic, theocracy led. They weren't led. Their governments weren't based around their religion, though, either.
Well, remember in Japan, the a large majority of the population still thought that the emperor was immortal.
Yeah.
It was a completely different culture. But, again, you're right. You and I are, kind of on the ground military guys.
Right.
But clearly, we failed in, the aftermath of the military part of it. And, the military still, keeps the peace and has to, maintain security until the country's up and running. But, if, after 2 decades, we couldn't get Afghanistan up and running, and we can debate all day why that was, why, what was that failure? The United States policy on how we were doing it? Was the failure just, the people of Afghanistan, or, some combination? Or were we distracted by another war, in Iraq that,
I think it was just a matter of time. I think if we would have kept a presence there and kept the country, I would say, under control for another 10, 15, 20 years, over time, the generations and the people, the culture would have kind of changed and accepted, that Western democracy type of government. And I think longer period of time might have done that for sure. But I don't know. Yeah,
it's the other thing too, there was, just so much rampant corruption.
Yeah.
And so, if you had a viable government with a bit less corruption, I think you would have stood a better chance. But, if you look at the IG reports out of Afghanistan over the last couple of years, about, the resources that we devoted, and the fact that a lot of them just disappeared and we don't even know where the money or
right
or anything is. I mean, I don't think we really ever had a recipe for success in Afghanistan, unfortunately. And
yeah, and I don't think what you're saying is a disparaging thing either. I just think it was a very difficult country to try and, fix.
Nobody else has been able to do it. I mean, the
Right.
Russians weren't able to do it.
Right.
Go back in history.
You mentioned the Russians. What was the anti-helicopter missile that we gave them that basically turned the tide? The Afghanis.
The
Stinger.
Yeah, the Stingers. Yep.
Yeah. So that was something that I just thought of. I haven't mentioned to anybody yet, but like literally, we gave the Afghanis one piece of equipment that turned the tide of that conflict. We gave them the Stinger missile, and they were able to use that to basically defeat the Russians, and that pales into comparison to what we gave them. Not that we physically gave it to them, but that they have now, like the equipment that we armed them with.
And a lot of people forget that back in those days, Osama bin Laden was on our side.
Yeah.
He was a mujahideen, and we were surreptitiously supplying the mujahideen, to fight the Russians, and so things change.
So let's transition that, because I don't know if you saw it or not, but the day after, I think this would have been Thursday, kind of the day after Kabul really fell, the Chinese released in the Global Times, which is one of their propaganda news sources, they released basically a statement to Taiwan. And I'm paraphrasing here, but they told Taiwan, well, I'm reading now, I got it up. It says, once a cross straits, they're talking about the straits there between the Taiwan and China. Once a cross straits war breaks out while the mainland China seizes the island with forces, the U.S. would have to have a much greater determination than it had with Afghanistan, Syria, and Vietnam if it wants to interfere. And it says, Taiwan authorities need to keep a sober head, and the secessionist forces, which is what they call the Taiwanese forces that don't want to be part of China, should reserve the ability to wake up from their dreams. From what happened in Afghanistan, they should perceive that once a war breaks out in the straits with Taiwan, the island's defenses will collapse within hours, and the U.S. military will not come to help. As a result, the DPP authorities will quickly surrender, while some high-level officials may flee by plane. They should keep the cross straits peace with political means rather than acting as strategic pawns of the U.S. and bear the bitter fruits of war. They're basically telegraphing Taiwan, and they're using this as propaganda, what happened in Afghanistan, saying, hey, Americans ain't coming to help you. And when we come for you with forces, they're not going to step in. They're not, and I mean, so when I read that, because just a couple of weeks ago, I was reading another report talking about how the timetable with, invading Taiwan is kind of creeping up. They're with Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, I forget which representative from China, they basically said, you're not the world superpower anymore. We are, point blank, right to our face. And you're not going to do anything here. And they're kind of calling our bluff, and it looked like things were ramping up. And then this just seems like the icing on the cake for them. While I think they know, also the Microsoft cyber hack, we put sanctions on Russia after SolarWinds, but with the Microsoft Exchange Server cyber hack, which China did, the Biden administration didn't do nothing to China. So I think all this stuff is just emboldened China, where I think they're fully confident at this point that we're not going to do anything if they step in Taiwan. My other prediction, I'm not a prophet, but my other prediction is I could see some collusion between China and Russia as well. And, if China goes after Taiwan, I think around the same time, Russia's going to go after Ukraine, because we're not going to fight a war on two fronts. And I don't think we're going to fight a war either way. But I really think that this has, all the weapons in the Middle East, setting the Middle East on fire, China going after Taiwan, Russia going after Ukraine. I think we got some serious geopolitical stuff that's going to be happening in the near future. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, we thought the world would be a safer place after Soviet Union collapsed and the
Right.
Cold War ended, but it just did not turn out that way. So, China is one of the biggest threats to the U.S. right now.
Yes.
And, not just externally, like in Taiwan, and, there was just a joint exercise between Russia and China, in Asia. So, one of my biggest fears is Russia and China colluding to, give the neighborhood bully a black eye. That would be very, very difficult for us to deal with. But, even here at home, as we're going to be talking about shortly, China is a huge threat.
Yeah, it is. And, on the Ukraine front, did you ever see that video of that Putin military advisor that was on one of their state-sponsored TV shows, warning, this was back when Ukraine had a whole bunch of soldiers on the border of Ukraine, and everyone's like, is it time? Is it time? And this Putin advisor basically, and you can go on YouTube and you can watch the news footage, and it's, you can close caption it so you can read it in English, but basically saying that, we're going to invade Ukraine, and the U.S. is going to get involved, and we're going to block out one of their cities. They're going to block out one of our cities, and then we're going to block out their country. That to me, I was just like, for people to be like, that'll never happen. I mean, this is a close advisor of Putin. I don't know if you ever saw that news conference or not, but
yeah, no, I didn't see that. But Ukraine is just kind of a repeat of the same playbook that Russia used in Crimea.
Yep.
And they kind of got away with that. So I think that emboldened the Russians to think that they can do the same thing in Ukraine. And in terms of Russia, China, North Korea, and for that matter Iran, all kind of have in their strategy that part of fighting a war with the United States is taking out the U.S. electric grid, which would completely distract the United States. Well, not only distract the United States, but, kill millions of its citizens.
Right.
So
I hate to say this, but like if something like that happened and Russia did black out one of our cities for 2 or 3 days as a warning shot, you know what I mean? That might, and it went no further than that might be the best thing that ever happened, because at that point people would be like, okay, so this is a reality and we do need to harden our grid. I don't want to wish that, because it would surely result in death and mayhem, but
yeah. And I always hesitate to say that, what we need is, for somebody to really give us a gut punch. But when you look, and we've already had a gut punch. So, I mean, we should, we should really take what happened in Texas in February as a cautionary note. So, this was the weather. This wasn't even, a state actor or an enemy, but, this was weather that we saw coming a week ahead of time. And yet, 4 million people in Texas end up out of power, millions on boil water orders. 210 people died as a result of that, largely from the collapse of the Texas electric grid. So most of the 210 people that died of either exposure, hypothermia, or carbon monoxide poisoning, because they, had to do
fires in their house,
something to keep warm, or going in their garage and turning on the car to try to keep warm. So when you kind of look at just what, Mother Nature can do to us when we see her coming, then just imagine if there was a large scale cyber attack or electromagnetic pulse, or for that matter, a solar flare, a geomagnetic disturbance that took out wide swaths of the US electric grid. And the results would be catastrophic. And we have known this for decades. We have known, I can show you government reports going back 4 decades talking about threats to the electric grid. And yet here we are in 2021, completely unprotected, with our most critical of critical infrastructures being largely self-regulated, and the government just not having either the ability or the intestinal fortitude to tell the 3,000 or so companies in the electric grid that they need to harden themselves against these known threats. So we've had these recent cyber attacks, like SolarWinds and the Colonial Pipeline and the attacks in the meatpacking industry and some of the technology companies. This has just been over and over and over. And yet, believe it or not, for all of your people listening, do you realize there is absolutely no requirement that anybody detect, mitigate, or remove malware from the electric grid? Right. So we know that in the Ukraine blackouts, the Russians used malware to take out the Ukraine electric grid. And we also know that somebody, who we deny it was us, took out the Iranian nuclear centrifuges, by, Stuxnet, a cyber attack there. But yet in the US electric grid, the thing that 333 million people depend on for their very lives, there is no requirement that anybody even look for malware in the electric grid.
Well, we know it's there. I mean, it's proven. We know it's there. There's just no requirement to get rid of it.
Nope, or even look for it.
Right.
And that's, that's insane. It's absolutely crazy that, so if there is one thing in the United States that's really our life support, it's the electric grid. So there's 16 critical infrastructures in the United States identified by Presidential Policy Directive 21. And of these 16 critical infrastructures, all of them are dependent on the electric grid. So, the energy sector as a critical infrastructure is, has an enabling effect on all the other 16 critical infrastructures. And we're talking about things like food, our medical system, our communication system, our defense manufacturing base, our water and wastewater systems, our transportation system. Everything that is critical to, maintaining our human population is all dependent on the electric grid. And, yet there are really no requirements. There's no federal requirements for the protection of the vast majority of the electric grid.
So, Michael, you're saying we should socialize the electric utility companies?
Well, and I know that that's a bad word, and probably especially with your play. But let me kind of give you an example. So right now, if you want to fly from wherever you are to someplace else in the country, you go to the airport, you go through security, you go through the machines to make sure you're not carrying something that you shouldn't carry. You get on the plane. The pilot has all of these federal aviation regulations to make sure that the air travel is safe. And in large part, I mean, when you look at the millions of people that fly all the time, and just all of the constant airplanes in the air, air travel in the United States is extremely safe. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons it's extremely safe is because there are regulations to make sure that the planes are safe, that there's adequate security getting on. So
that's the same with cars. That's the same with drugs. That's the same with food.
If you want to call that socialism, then a little degree of government regulation in critical things is key.
No, I agree. That was just a joke. So I know that you're not. But no, that's a good point. And it comes down to basically people have faith that these things are safe. They get on a plane. They don't know why. They don't know the FAA regulation that requires that plane, those engines get, remanufactured every so many miles, and they don't know any of the regulations. They just have complete faith that that plane's safe. They have complete faith that the box of food they pull out of the cabinet from the grocery store is safe to eat. They have faith in all these things, and they have faith in the electric grid without knowing that there's no federal oversight or there's no federal regulation enforcing any of these security measurements to keep us safe. It's the one industry that is like the Wild West, and they get to do whatever they want. They report to themselves. They pay their own fines into their own coffers. They pay those fines onto the person paying the electric. It's literally insanity. And I know you're every bit as frustrated as I am. Is like, how can we show the people how dangerous this is and how like we're playing with fire, you know?
Yeah. Well, and the industry, they created this regulatory regime, this self-regulatory regime. This is something they lobbied very, very strongly for. After the Great Northeast Blackout of 2003, they saw the writing on the wall, because before 2003, there was voluntary self-regulation of the part of the electric grid known as the bulk power system, which is basically the transmission piece. And so just as a quick, let's back up for a second. So what is the electric grid? The electric grid actually has three pieces to it, which is the generation of electricity, the transmission of electricity over long distances, and then the distribution of electricity, which is where the electricity comes into our homes and businesses. So the only part of the electric grid that has any type of federal regulation is the transmission piece. And that came after the Great Northeast Blackout of 2003. Prior to 2003, the whole thing was voluntary self-regulation. After 2003, we went to mandatory self-regulation. It's still regulation, but now the industry writes its own standards that it has to follow, and then the industry polices itself, and the federal government only kind of has an oversight role over this, small portion of it, which is the transmission portion of the bulk power system. And the federal government doesn't have any direct authority to tell the electric grid what to do.
That's key. So, I mean, they have oversight, but not authority. And that's a big difference, yep. Right? Yep. Because, if you pump out a drug and it kills a bunch of people, they've got authority and they're coming yep. after you, right? If you make some food that gets a bunch of people sick, they're coming after you. If you build a plane that crashes, the federal government's going to come after you, right? Yep. Yep. And the electric grid, the FERC tells NERC all the time, hey, you guys should do this. I mean, the Aurora vulnerability is a perfect example. Hey, you guys need to fix this problem. Yeah, we're 15 years later and they haven't done it.
Yep. The government makes suggestions, and then the industry says, oh yes, in our government industry partnership kumbaya, and then nothing gets done.
Right.
And so over the years, what has happened, in my estimation, is, so not only has the electric utility industry created this regulatory regime, but they've also co-opted the federal regulators. So the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, and the Department of Energy, the electric utility industry has embedded themselves into these agencies, to make sure that the agencies don't, go too far. So you basically got the tail wagging the regulatory dog. Yep. And I can give you a couple of examples that might really, really tick off the people watching this. So, it came to my attention that there had been hundreds and hundreds of physical attacks against the electric grid, and that the physical security standards for the bulk power system, there's no physical security standards for the whole electric grid, but for the one little piece of it, there's allegedly a physical security standard. And it was not being enforced, and it was not adequate, because we were continuing to have physical attacks against the electric grid. As a matter of fact, as of now, there have been 721 physical attacks against the electric grid since 2010. So I filed a complaint with FERC about the physical security of the electric grid, that it was inadequate, not enforced, that there were all these loopholes. The entire electric utility industry came out against the complaint with FERC and told FERC they should dismiss it. So what did FERC do? They dismissed it. Same thing happened with the cybersecurity complaint. I made a complaint after the some of the recent hacks about the cybersecurity of the electric grid. The electric utility industry came out and said, no, FERC, you don't need to order new standards. You don't need to order new enforcement. Just dismiss this guy's complaint. And they did. Texas Blackout, same thing. I filed a complaint that the mandatory reliability standards either were inadequate or not followed, as evidenced by the fact that, we had the blackout in Texas, which killed 210 people and caused between 60 to 180 billion dollars in economic damage. I file a complaint about the reliability standards. The industry comes out against it and says, no, nothing to see here, move on, and FERC dismissed the complaint. So FERC is not telling the electric utility industry with a sense of urgency that they need to protect themselves against these hazards.
Okay, so the first thing that, a lot of people are going to jump out and say there's a conspiracy, it's deep state. And so I always want to tread lightly on that stuff. Mm-hmm. I never want to ascribe conspiracy where incompetence is, the easier explanation without evidence. FERC. So who's heading up FERC? Aren't a lot of the kind of the leadership in FERC, didn't they come from NERC? Aren't they former executives?
Well, yeah, a lot of the, so the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is a commission. Right. And so the commissioners are appointed by the president, and then for a term. So, you've got people, and in terms of, and you're absolutely right, Jonathan, this isn't a conspiracy or a deep state thing. This has been going on for decades. So we have administrations, both red and blue, that have failed to address this issue. So this is not a political issue. This is just a incompetence of government issue. So the commissioners who are appointed by the president typically do come out of the electric utility industry, either attorneys that represented the industry for years or people that come out of some of the big companies in the industry, the companies regulating the industry. That's typically where most of the commissioners have come from. So now, one of the problems that I've always, kind of looked at is, well, if you're a FERC commissioner, once you leave the commission, you're going to have a cushy job back with some law firm that represents the industry, or
right.
Back with, some other company in the industry. So, don't rock the boat too much. So, the chairman of FERC has just recently, changed. So it was last year, it was Neil Chatterjee, who was a appointee of the Republican administration. Now it's Richard Glick. Doesn't really matter, in my mind, who it is. FERC as a commission has failed to address grid security in a, meaningful way.
They give a lot of lip service to it, and the media carry the water for them all the time.
Yeah.
And that's very frustrating to see because, even the Chinese at this point think that we're hardening our grid by 2032, that we're racing full speed ahead to harden our grid. They just released, they're concerned that we're going to have a hardened grid. And the fact of the matter is all of our grid hardening, it's all on paper.
Oh, and honestly, I think the Chinese are smart enough to know how stupid we are, and we're not hardening our grid. And in matter of fact, the Chinese are selling us equipment to install into the electric grid that we're already hacking. So to me, the Chinese are brilliant. I mean, they're doing a great marketing job. They're underselling other sources for equipment in the electric grid in order that, we install Chinese equipment into the electric grid. And yet nobody's even looking at this issue of Chinese equipment in the electric grid.
So let's transition, because that was your latest article. And that was one of the main points I wanted to hit today was, I think 2 newsletters ago, my main highlight was, this, the report that you'd put out about 10% of New York City getting their power by, what was it, 18% of Las Vegas?
20% of Las Vegas.
20% for Las Vegas. And, that they were, at that point, how many did you know of at that point when you released that last article? It wasn't a lot, right?
And it's developed. So at the time I put out that article about Lights Out New York City, we knew about 300 large Chinese transformers that we had imported into the United States. And we knew that at least 200 of those were embedded in the electric grid, probably closer to the 300, but it's possible that some large industries might, order a transformer. But, so we knew about 300 large Chinese transformers that had been imported. However, most recently, I was able to find that that data was up through 2019. So up through 2019, we had imported 300 Chinese transformers. So in 2020, we imported another 66 large transformers from China into our, for installation into our electric grid. And there are more orders for 2021. So we're continuing to import Chinese equipment, large equipment into the electric grid.
So I think, Michael, a lot of people would jump in and say, well, so what? We have Chinese stereos and we buy Chinese TVs and this and that, but we have evidence, right, of what happened when they confiscated that. So the transformer from JHSP. So go ahead and talk about that.
Yeah. So we had in last May, the Wall Street Journal published an article talking about that in 2019, the US government seized one of these transformers that comes from a Chinese company called JSHP and took it to Sandia National Laboratories. Now, the government has been mum ever since they seized that transformer, but I want you to think about a couple things. First of all, these transformers cost millions of dollars. This particular one, was huge, a huge transformer that was destined for the Western Area Power Administration, or WAPA, and was going to be supplying Denver with electricity. That's where this thing was going. So all of a sudden, the government seizes this thing, takes it to Sandia National Laboratories, this multi-million-dollar piece of equipment.
And they wouldn't do that without any evidence,
No.
You know what I mean?
Yep. So, and then last year, around the same time as this Wall Street Journal article came out, there was an executive order, put out by the previous administration on securing the critical electric infrastructure. And particularly what that said was that we were going to put out rules about not importing equipment from adversaries, to put into our critical electric infrastructure. So that executive order happened, I believe it was May of 2020.
Yes, it did.
And then the executive order was suspended in January of 2021. And, DOE put out a call for request for information, to find out what should be done. So, one of the things that people could look at is the paper that I sent to DOE for their request for information about security of the electric grid, which is a pretty good primer on what's going on with grid security. So, even though, we seized this transformer in 2019, took it to our national laboratory, the following year, we put out an executive order about this threat. As we're sitting here today, companies are still importing this equipment from China and installing it on the electric grid, and there are more orders pending. We're still doing it. So, here is, China, which is, probably our biggest global adversary. I mean, we can argue China, Russia, but, I think in my mind, China's doing much better job than Russia right now of taking over the world.
Their Belt and Road Initiative, and
they're on every continent right now. They're embedding themselves everywhere.
5G networks.
One place they're embedding themselves is the United States electric grid.
Yep.
So when we look at these transformers, so I've been tracking this. So we've, as of now, from what I can see from International Trade Commission, U.S. International Trade Commission data, we've imported 366 large Chinese transformers. There's some other UN data that has an even higher number than that.
Right.
Which about 300 more. So, but, just taking the more conservative number, the 366, and then, continuing to import more of these in. Well, what's the big deal? Well, if the Chinese are already hacking the electric grid, what could possibly go wrong if we buy Chinese equipment to install on the electric grid? So it's
insanity.
And I kind of shake my head because, why isn't there a requirement that somebody check this stuff? And there isn't. There's no requirement. So you can import in this Chinese equipment if you're an electric company. You can install it, and there's no requirement that you check it. to see whether it has some kind of a back door or, some type of a vulnerability. And that's what the federal government needs. The federal government needs to step up and make mandatory requirements for protection of the electric grid, just like we have in our food industry, just like we have in our aviation and our transportation industry.
Okay, so you're absolutely correct. I think everybody, based on that information, would agree with that. For 20 years, the E&P Commission, the Secure the Grid Coalition, they've had conferences with senators. I've been there. I've talked to Senator Scott Perry or Congressman Scott Perry and Senator Cruz. And I'm nobody, but they've been meeting with these congressmen for 20 something years on this subject, and nothing's gotten done. We know part of that we can blame EPRI's fake science reports and different things coming out. But do you have any hope that the government's going to actually pass anything on this with the amount of lobbying and the amount of power the utility industries hold over our government?
Yes and no. And so this all depends on the people watching this right now. So if we all sit back and let the government do their job, there is no hope, because the electric utility industry spent $1.2 billion in the last decade lobbying just the federal Congress alone, making political contributions on the order of $150 million to key senators and representatives on the Energy Committee that has basically jurisdiction over energy legislation. So if we let the present system go the way it is right now, no, nothing's going to get done. Congress is not going to pass a law that the electric utility industry doesn't want them to pass. Now, where I do have hope is that for everybody watching this, me and Jonathan Hollerman are regular people, veterans, but we're regular citizens. We're not electrical engineers or anything like that. But you can make a difference just by being heard. And the way you've got to be heard is you've got to get this information that we're giving to you, to your representative, your senators. And we've got to make demands of our elected officials that they protect the electric grid. And if the citizens aren't heard on this, Washington is just going to go on the way it does right now, with lobbyists paying, big money to make sure that regulation that their industry doesn't want is kept at bay. And the only thing that's going to stop that is citizens getting involved and going to the representatives and the senators and saying, why are we importing equipment into our electric grid from China when China's already hacking our electric grid? Can you explain that to me, and can you do something about it?
Right. So I'm with you. So it's got to happen at the grassroots. And you and I have had long conversations about this. We won't get into it now. I don't have the exact solution. I've mentioned, if we get a TV show, because the American people, this is a complicated subject. We've been talking here for 45 minutes now on this, and we barely even scratched the surface of the iceberg, right? Yeah. Of the amount of information that there is behind this and the evidence. I literally had somebody I know and respect that's been around this industry for the last, I don't know how many years. And it's somebody that's very close. And they were like, I don't see any reason to make any plans. He's like, I don't really know that it's really a high probability event. And I'm sitting there thinking if you just looking at the EMP threat from North Korea, you can make the case it's a low probability event, right? But if you add up the EMP threat from China and Russia and North Korea and Iran in the future, and then you add that to the cyber threat, and then we're 100 years past due for a solar flare, the physical threats. There's a great report that I just talked about yesterday on the massive increase on terrorists using attacks on electric grids all over the world that will find its way to our shore in the future. If you start adding up conglomerate of all these threats to our grid, and then you figure in the fact that that is the one way, if a country wanted to destroy us militarily, that'd be very difficult to defeat the U.S. military on U.S. turf, if not impossible, right? But this simple thing that we're so vulnerable, America's Achilles heel, it's not a hard thing to pull off, and we're completely unprotected on it. So the idea this hasn't happened is kind of fascinating to me yet, that some terrorist organization hasn't really coordinated this. I mean, they spent how many years planning? 12 guys, Al Qaeda over here, trained them through pilot school and flew them in the World Trade Center and a couple other locations to kill a couple thousand people, you know, because back then the evidence of the grid vulnerability of the US and the death and destruction that could come from it wasn't really widely known on the American or on the world, you know. It wasn't really widely talked about or discussed, but it is now, and it definitely has been over the last couple of years. So, you know, they have, you know, we'll call it a gut punch, but they have the ability to do a knockout blow to our country with minimal money, minimal effort, minimal resources, and we're doing nothing about it.
Yeah, and you know, when you look at the level of sophistication that the 9/11 attack took to do, it would take much less sophistication to do a coordinated physical attack against the electric grid. I mean, if I was a terrorist, that's what I would do, because you're absolutely right. You can't beat the US militarily. You know, what is the thing that you could do that would inflict the maximum amount of damage? And that is attacking the electric grid. And knowing this and knowing that, you know, we've got 4 decades of federal reports and hearings about the threats to the electric grid. And yet today, there is still no federal requirements for protecting, you know, the entire electric grid from any of these threats. None. You know, the very few requirements that do exist only, you know, apply to a couple of facilities in the bulk power system, and the electric utility industry wrote them themselves. Yeah. They're not going to write a standard that's hard to achieve. You know, they're writing a standard that their, you know, constituency, all these, you know, electric utility companies can easily and inexpensively do. So, you know,
one of the, where I used to go to church in Pittsburgh, right behind the church, and this was in Pittsburgh, right behind the church was a massive, you know, high voltage lines, high voltage transformer sitting there. And it was on the side of a hill with nothing anywhere near it, with a 6-foot chain link fence around it. And I remember kind of walking over there. There wasn't even a padlock on the gate at the time, you know? And I'm just sitting here thinking, like, this is crazy. So even the standards they do write, they don't enforce them. The standards aren't strong enough. They don't even enforce the standards they do have. And when a company breaks one of their standards, or when something happens and someone gets through one of their standards, they're required to self-report it. We're not allowed to know who did it. And they pay their own fine into their own industry coffers, and it all gets swept under the rug. Why would any of these companies, you know, drastically follow any of these weak standards to begin with? You know, it's just,
well, and you know, the standards are a joke. You know, to give you, you know, an example on the physical security. So they immediately, in the physical security standard, which as it is only applies to the transmission system, the bulk power system, so it doesn't apply to the whole electric grid. So standard applies to that. They immediately exempted generation. So generation stations don't have to follow the physical security standard. And then they exempted almost every facility in the bulk power system. So very few facilities even have to follow the standard. And what does the standard require? The standard requires that you have a notebook that says physical security, that has certain papers in it. It's an administrative standard. And there's no requirement that anybody with any physical security experience writes any physical security plan or reviews it. You just need to have this notebook, and it's got to be blessed off by somebody who does not have to have physical security experience, just a third party outside of your utility. So you can use a peer utility. So, you know, hey, you know, PG&E, you know, this is Enron. Can you come and look at our physical security standard, and we'll look at yours? Wink, wink, nod, nod. So, you know, the standard is a complete joke. The physical security standard is a complete joke. And, you know, the United States is very vulnerable to a coordinated physical attack against the electric grid. As a matter of fact, when I filed my complaint about the vulnerability of the electric grid, I included a whole bunch of Google Earth maps where I mapped out a piece of the electric grid on Google Earth. Just me, regular citizen, mapped it out where the grid could be attacked, you know, with a drone attack from, you know, half a mile away. So you don't even have to be there. You know, you can attack the electric grid remotely. You can reconnoiter the electric grid, through tools that everybody and every terrorist has on their computer. And yet we do not have even a modicum of physical security requirements for the electric grid. How is this even possible? And I guess, why, Jonathan, the physical security thing irritates me the most out of everything. The physical security piece irritates me because in 1981, GAO came out with a report about how inadequate the physical security of the electric grid was. 1981, 40 years ago, we got a report talking about the inadequate physical security of the electric grid. And here we are talking now, 40 years later, about the exact same thing. It's crazy. And it's got to end, because if we do not get the federal government to do its job and order mandatory grid security requirements and secure our electric grid, we're going to remain vulnerable until somebody decides, to take it out. And right now, our lights are on at the discretion of the Russians and the Chinese. The Secretary of Energy in June said that state actors have the ability to take out our electric grid through a cyber attack. Yep. So that means right now, the fact that your lights are on, you can thank China and Russia for not being ticked off at us enough right at this particular moment to shut it off. That is not a position that we want to be in the United States.
Admiral Rogers, the former director of the
National Security Council.
Yeah, but he was U.S. Cyber Command. He was head of U.S. Cyber Command.
Right.
Back in 2016, you go to C-SPAN right now. Back in 2016, he sat before Congress, and they were asking him about the cyber threat on the electric grid. Is this something that's going to happen? Down the road. We have reports that there's probably going to be a cyber attack on electric grid within the next decade, and we have all these intel reports, and he's like, I think it's going to happen in my next term. He said it is the thing that concerns him the most. And I mean, his term ended a long time ago, right? That was 5 years ago. He said this, and nothing is happening. So anyways, with that said, we're running along. Hey, Michael, so before we sign off here, I want to encourage everyone that's listening to this right now. He mentioned earlier that the electric utility industry, okay, so what can you do? How can you out there help us and help Michael Mabee and help the Security Grid Coalition to fix this, okay? So first, I would say, a lot of my followers that, some of you are high net worth people, some of you guys have some cash. Listen, the utility industry spent $1.2 billion over the last decade lobbying Congress to prevent any kind of oversight and any kind of regulation. Michael Mabee single-handedly has brought to light a lot of this stuff that's happening. He gets no funding. Okay. He literally, I wasn't even joking when I said he used his wife's grocery money to do this stuff. There are legal suits. There are dozens of things that he could be doing that he can't do because he's one guy and he's got no budget. He, I think a lot of the legal guys that do work with you pro bono because they believe in this threat. And so we really could get some assistance. So if you have the ability to donate to Michael Mabee, and same thing I would say with the Secure the Grid Coalition, which has been on the forefront of trying to bring awareness to this. They have weekly meetings every Friday discussing what's going on and trying to raise awareness. So if you have the financial means, I would almost beg you at this point, donate to Michael Mabee, michaelmabee.org. Go to the Secure the Grid Coalition, STG Coalition. Donate to them. Help us fight this fight. Help us to raise awareness. And so if you don't have the financial resources to this, there's nothing stopping you from writing a letter to your congressman and to your senator. Okay. So one of the biggest pieces of information comes from Michael Mabee himself. One of the best kind of outliers to explain the situation. Because again, like we're saying, this is a very complicated subject. This is very complicated. And if you follow me on Patreon or follow me on YouTube, you know that I talked about this was back in April. In my opinion, hands down, the biggest, most concise explanation of where we are, why we are where we are, and the problems with the electric grid. It's footnoted, it's hyperlinked, it's documented evidence as to where we are with the electric grid and why it needs to be fixed. Is Michael Mabee's his RFI to the DOE. So the DOE, Department of Energy, had asked for requests for information on comments in regards to continued security of the United States critical electric grid. And, hey, they're asking, what do we need to secure the grid? Not like we haven't been talking about this for 40 years, like you just mentioned, but Michael Mabee put together this excellent document. I'll put the link down below to where you can download it. But if you have friends, if you have family members that you guys kick this around and they're like, oh, I don't really think this is really true, give them this document. Give them this document. It lays everything out simply right out in front of you. It's irrefutable evidence. So share this document, share it with your friends and family, write a letter to your congressman, to your senator, include this document with it because they probably haven't seen it because it's went to the DOE. And I'm sure that probably half the people at the DOE that have requested it haven't read it. But anyways, that's what you can do out there to help. So help us raise awareness. Michael Mabee and Secure the Grid Coalition, they have a lot more faith than I do that we're going to be able to raise awareness and get something fixed here. I mean, I am always people, it's real easy to paint me as a pessimist because of the negative nature of the stuff that I talk about. I do have hopes that some smoking gun or something's going to come out. We're going to be able to get this thing fixed. But in the meantime, beans and bullets, people, make preparations for your family and be wise, because the fact that something hasn't happened with the grid at this point is mind, gobsmacking to me. And I really, don't live your life in fear. Don't cash in your kid's college fund. I'm not saying any of that stuff, but make preparations today. Get your mind thinking about, what this would mean for you and your family, and make some plans today. So Michael, I'll give you the last word.
Okay, well, and actually, you just said it. We really need people to get involved, and by getting involved, that just means, contacting your representative, your elected official, your senators, even at your state level, your state representatives, and, talk to other people. We really need, if we're going to fix the electric grid and get it secured and, protect our families, it's going to take just a, groundswell of public concern raised to Congress, because as of right now, nothing's going to happen because, the electric utility industry is paying them handsomely, to keep regulation at bay. We need to demand, of our elected officials that they fix this problem. And if they don't, if you're attempting to contact this elected official and, you just aren't getting any satisfaction, then you need to consider that in the voting booth. We need to vote people out that aren't protecting our families and, reward the ones that do. And, I'll give you a great example. I had an experience with a federal representative and also state representatives that I contacted that did listen to me and did take action. Those people won my vote. Other representatives that I never heard back from, or I couldn't even get a staff person on the phone to talk to about this, they did not get my vote. That's the way I roll. Is, if you are protecting me and my family, then you've earned my vote. That's kind of my main issue. But we've got to hold our elected officials accountable to fix this mess with the security of the electric grid.
Yep. Truer words could be said. So again, contact representatives. Again, Michael's not going to ask for money. Donate to him. Help him continue this fight. Help him continue the research, going after the FOIAs and keeping the electric utilities feet to the fire. At some point, he's probably going to have to hire private security if he gets too deep into this mess. But anyways, Michael, I really appreciate you coming on today. This has been one of my favorite interviews I've done in quite a while. So keep up the good work. Keep fighting this good fight. And we're definitely going to have you on again soon.
All right. Stay safe, brother.
All right. You too. As always, everyone, prepare for the worst, hope for the best, and let God do the rest. Take care.